Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on how to prepare for and handle an FDA FSMA visit. My name is Holly Cardozo, and I'm pleased to welcome you here today. I'm a member of the marketing team with SAI Global. Before we kick off the webinar, I'll just speak to a few housekeeping slides. Firstly, if you can see us but you can't hear us during the webinar, I invite you to refer back to your registration link. So get you both into the audio and visual portion of the webinar. You're automatically muted upon joining the webinar. Should you wish to interact with us, you can do so in one of two ways. One is through our quick poll question. We have one quick poll today. We'll capture your response and share so you can see how you sit amongst your peers. The other way that you may interact with us during the webinar is through our question and answer session at the end of the webinar. There's a box in the upper right-hand side of your screen with 3 small arrows. If you click on that, enter your question, and I encourage you to do so as you think of them. We can have some time to review before the end of the presentation. We'll speak to as many questions at the end as we can, and if we don't get to your question, we'll definitely follow up on a one-to-one basis. You can collapse that Q&A box off to the right of the screen by clicking on those 3 small arrows a second time. I'll remind everyone that we will be recording the webinar today, and we'll share a link to both the recording as well as the slide deck within a few business days. With that, I'll introduce you to our presenter today, Dr. Bob Strong. He is one of our lead consultants and trainers with SAI Global. He's been with us a number of years, and he's a wealth of information across all areas of food safety operations, and I'm very pleased to welcome him. Dr. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks for everybody who's coming on to the webinar today. It feels like we have a lot of loyal followers. We always gain new followers, and we've got quite a lot of people who are interested in the topic today, which is great. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about what has got some people very concerned, and that is the more aggressive FDA. The FDA who's coming to visit you now based on FSMA, based on the Food Safety Modernization Act. So first of all, we'll get into in a minute who's exempt, so that you have to know you will not get a FSMA visit from the FDA. We're going to talk about who the FDA went to visit in 2018, so we can learn a little from those people who already had that visit. And we'll also be able to cover with you what the FDA has said, and my facts are coming from the FDA, on who will they visit in fiscal 2019. Now, what you have to realize, fiscal 2019 started on October the 1st for the FDA, so they're already 3.5 months into it. We're going to talk about how you prepare for this visit to make it less traumatic, to hopefully make it go smoother. And we're going to talk about what the FDA is going to be concentrating on in these visits when they're doing a FSMA inspection. And then we're going to talk a little about how you practice for it ahead of time, because practice, as they say, makes perfect. If not perfect, at least a little less stressful. So we got a first poll to get an idea of where you feel you are nervous or not feeling good about.
Thanks, Dr. Bob. So what is your greatest struggle in preparation for an FDA inspection? Let me launch the poll here. I'll speak to the questions. So, or the answer, excuse me. Understanding what the FDA will be looking for. Perhaps this is unclear to you. Understanding what exemptions perhaps apply to you. Understanding what you'll need to prepare for sharing with the inspectors. Ensuring that you have sufficient training for your people. Or perhaps you're in a great shape and you are prepared. So I'll invite you to select the one response that's most appropriate for your organization. Give you about 20 seconds and then we'll share the results. We obviously thought this was a very meaty topic, one that's been requested by a number of our past webinar registrants. Dr. Bob, what would you expect to see as the greatest struggle that folks are presented with?
I think that people just don't know exactly what the FDA is going to be looking for, and as we're going to talk about in a minute, they're not coming for a day or two. They're coming in some cases for 8 or 9 days, and they're coming with several investigators. So I think that's what they're worried about, is what's going to happen.
Indeed. We'll close and share the results here. So unsurprisingly, 47%, what will the FDA be looking for? Second would be, of course, what do you need to prepare for sharing? But lots of concern. Not many folks on the call today that feel they're totally prepared.
Well, that's somewhat not surprising, when you consider that we're not sure But we're beginning to get more sure what the FDA is looking for, because we're getting feedback from people who've had inspections. The FDA is sharing with us their feedback that they're getting from people who've had inspections. So let's get into that. First of all, let's get into who's exempt. So again, if you already were under seafood Hasip, juice Hasip, you're a very small facility, these people have been told that they will not get a FDA FSMA audit. They'll get a regular FDA seafood Hasip audit, etc. And they will also get an audit against the new GMPs, because that changed for everybody. And the FDA has also indicated they're going to get into doing produce audits this year. And why are distribution centers, again, just to remind you, while they're exempt, that they're doing only shelf-stable food, fully packaged products, the FDA feels they have no ability to add a hazard or get rid of a hazard, so therefore, why would you come in and do a FSMA audit? So let's look back at where the FDA went in fiscal 2018. Now, remember, that goes from October the 1st, 2017 to September the 30th, 2018. What were they looking at? And this is numbers coming actually from the FDA. And you will get a copy of all these slides, so you don't have to be writing this all down. But if you'll notice, they were predominantly looking at ready-to-eat foods, foods that maybe needed a little preparation by the consumer, but very little, sometimes just reheating. And they did it on domestic, and they did it on foreign countries. Pretty well everybody for something. And you say, well, were they citing them for FSMA violations? They didn't have their food safety plan? Not necessarily, but they were citing them for GMP violations that they were finding. And we'll get into that. And it's rather amazing when you look at the percentage of people who are getting cited. 25 up to over 50% of people were getting cited for something. And how many inspections did they do in total? 440. And they've also got states doing them. They've approved some states to do audits on behalf of the FDA. And you say, well, what does limited PC inspections mean? Those are ones that are exempt from doing a full preventive control program to having limited. So you say, well, who would that be? Well, that would be people who have distribution centers who have temperature sensitive foods. They would have to meet the temperature control requirements, etc. Well, they get a lot of those, but that's not surprising when you consider that's where they have been in the past, is doing regular GMP audits, but now they're switching to doing FSMA audits. So how long should you expect them to come? Well, one of the things is, are they coming to do preventive control of human foods, and they're going to do a full inspection of you? They're going to be there for 4 to 5 days. And we're not talking one person. We're talking 2 or 3 or 4 FDA people all in at once. And we're going to talk about how you're going to handle that. If they're coming to do a limited one, then it's 3 to 4 days, but it's still several days. If they're coming in to do a swabathon, and even the FDA thinks that's funny, but that's a term that's been adopted for this, they're going to be 7 to 9 days in your facility. And they did 18 of those in 2018, and we'll talk about what they're going to do in 2019. So obviously what we're looking to is a whole lot of FDA people showing up at the door, and they're not coming in ones, they're coming in 2s and they're 3s, and they're not coming for 4 hours, they're coming for days. So what will they be concentrating on, and what else could be included when they do come? So we look at the deviations that they say they found when they were in, and they broke it into domestic and foreign. And a lot of it is common across whether you're domestic or foreign. Remember, if you're a foreign supplier supplying into the United States, and that means you could be Canadian sending into America or any other country in the world, the FDA does have a right to come and visit you, and the FDA is coming to visit you. And so what were they finding? They were finding problems against the GMPs. They're finding problems with no hazard analysis, or no written food safety plan, or no ability to show that you were monitoring for allergens and preventing allergen cross-contact. And you didn't have any written sanitation verification procedure, so therefore maybe not doing HEP swabbing, not doing allergen swabbing. Therefore, they didn't feel you had your program what it needed to be. And if you look across the foreign suppliers, it's somewhat of the same things, except they were finding there some pest prevention problems, which is interesting because they weren't identifying that domestically. And they were finding some water problems with regard to the source of the water, which again is maybe more of a foreign challenge than it is domestically. But learn from these. These are the things that they've already found. These are the things they've already gone against. So you say, well, what are they going to do in 2019? That was 2018. First of all, how many audits are they going to do? They're going to do, they've said and budgeted 500 domestic and 150 foreign suppliers. I still think they're going to concentrate more on ready to eat. So if your product isn't ready to eat, it doesn't mean they're not coming. But I think if you are ready to eat, you've got a bigger chance they are coming. They have indicated they're going to increase their swabbing from not just doing Listeria monocytogenes, but they are going to include Salmonella. And that was in the Preventive Controls. But they didn't do swabbing for Salmonella in the past, but they are going to do now. Remember, food defense goes into effect, and the FDA calls that intentional adulteration in July, and they've indicated they're going to start doing those audits after July for those companies who have to have the food defense in effect in July of this year. So again, if you're going to have if the FDA walks in after July and you're a big company, you better have your food defense when it needs to be, and that involves training. And again, remember, we're the source of this training. We're the source of helping you get where you need to be. They're also going to be picking up more samples. And that's what they did last year. They picked up samples of product in the marketplace, took it back to their labs, and started looking at it for Listeria. And they've already published some of those findings. They've also been looking at things with regard to parasites. So you say, well, what are they going to do with dark chocolates? They didn't actually say, but I can give you my guess. They're going to be looking for milk, because that would be an undeclared allergen in dark chocolates, and we know that is an issue. They're going to be looking for Salmonella, which again tends to be an issue if you're not controlling your programs. And remember, that means if you're buying these things, you better be sure your supplier is controlling them if you have no ability to control them. What are they going to be looking at for frozen berries? Well, we've had a lot of hepatitis A outbreaks over the years. And I would suspect that's what they're going to be looking at, and maybe they're going to look at that more with foreign suppliers than they are with domestic. Parsley, cilantro, and basil have tended to have their problems in the past with regard to parasites. So I would suspect that maybe where they're going to look, or maybe they're looking for pesticides, which again, if it's a foreign supplier, is more likely to be a problem than a domestic grower. And they've already done some work on avocados, and they've shown that Listeria is quite often on the outside of the avocado, at about 17%, I think they said. But they've actually showed that on the inside, on the pulp, and therefore in avocado-type products and guacamole, they've only found it at a very low percent. So what that indicates is, if you wash the avocados real well, you should get rid of the problem. Remember a few years ago when people had the caramel apple problem and they had Listeria on it, and they hadn't washed the apples before they put the caramel on the outside? Well, that's an example of why you should wash your fruit, no matter what you're going to do with it later. So now we know where they've been. We know where they say they're going. And that doesn't mean they're not going to be doing regular FDA inspections against GMP for those who are not having to do a FSMA audit. But remember, the one thing I forgot to say is that, remember, you've got to be registered with the FDA. So one of the things they're going to be checking on is, are you registered with the FDA? And did you re-register in the end of last year between October the 1st and December the 31st? So getting ready for an FDA is partly the success to having a good FDA inspection, because they're coming. The question is, when are they coming? And they're not going to announce it. We've got the new GMPs going into effect, so be sure that you're going and abiding by the new GMPs, not the old GMPs. Make sure you have food safety plans, not Hasip plans. And these are available and up to date to put in front of the regulator, because you know they're going to ask for it as soon as they walk in. Review all your records to show that not only you have these plans, but they are complete, accurate, verified, up to date, and actually work. And then last but not least, the FDA will not accept anything that isn't in English. So therefore, if you're getting third-party audit reports that are coming in languages from foreign suppliers, you're going to have to translate them. You have to decide when you're going to do that and how you're going to do that. But I'm going to tell you, you better do it ahead of the FDA coming in, or you're going to require your suppliers to give you everything in English. The FDA is not willing to accept non-English documents. So now, as I'm preparing for an FDA inspection, I got to prepare as if it's going to happen tomorrow. So I have to have a team of people, because the FDA is coming with a team of people. And where's it going to start going wrong? Immediately they come in, and your receptionist hasn't been trained on how to greet them, how to evaluate that they are the FDA, how to make sure that they're welcomed into the facility. Where are you going to have them sit in the meeting room? And what do I mean by that? Well, if you're going to seat them in a meeting room where there's a window and the FDA person can look out into your plans, I think you want to make sure they sit with their back to that window. Then they can't be looking out as they're talking to you and seeing people out there doing things that you go, I wish they couldn't see that. Maybe if you got blinds in there, you draw the blinds so they can't see out into the plant. I don't think you want to give them the opportunity to be evaluating what you're doing while they're still in the meeting room talking to you. You also have to decide who's going to answer the questions. Because unless the FDA directs the questions to a specific person, you can designate who should answer the questions. But again, make sure that that person is very good in answering questions and has the information available to answer those questions. You can't stop the FDA talking to somebody else. So if they turn to one of your colleagues and ask them a question, you can't say that question has to be addressed to me. The FDA can question anybody at any time about anything. So you have to determine who's going to have these food safety plans at their fingertips or know how to get them and the records and be able to explain them to the FDA, having put them in front of them, and then they start asking you a lot of questions. You don't want to be stumbling over the answers. You don't want to say, I don't know, somebody else developed the plan, I'm not sure who did our hazard analysis, I'm not sure how we came up with that critical control point or whatever. And now the FDA is going to move out of that conference room and they are going to start to spread out across your plant. Well, in the past, if it was one person, that was easy. You all followed the one person and you all stayed with the one person. But now you're going to have 2 or 3 or 4 other people. You better have 2 or 3 or 4 of your people to be able to escort them, one going with one going with the other, one going with the other. Otherwise, you don't want to turn the FDA loose and not have them. We can be helpful in helping you with that. I wish I had time to go through all of this in greater detail, excuse me, but with the 45-minute limit, we can't get into the details that we could in a more detailed thing. But I want to highlight for you what you should be thinking about. Who's going to be on that team? How are you going to split them? How are you going to send the most knowledgeable person with the FDA person who is going out to do different things? Because if you don't, all you've got is a person wandering around who doesn't have the answers, and that's going to be frustrating for you. That's going to be frustrating for the FDA, and that's going to add extra questions. So let's step back a minute to that food safety plan. And remember, you have to have a food safety plan. The minimum in that food safety plan has to be a hazard analysis. So you can't say, I didn't do a hazard analysis. And how many hazard analyses you have to do is dependent upon how many different ingredients you have, how many different products you have, how many different processes you have. And maybe you'll be lucky that one hazard analysis will cover it all, one food safety plan will cover it all, but I doubt it if you're making a multitude of different products. Because having determined what hazards are foreseeable, And remember that there is a training class called Preventive Controls for Human Foods, and we do teach that. And we can bring that class to you, or you can come to one of our public classes. Because based on that hazard analysis, if you've done a good job, you're already past the first hurdle. If you haven't done a good job, the regulator is going to be pointing out to you that you missed some foreseeable hazards. And again, you're getting more nervous now, because I've already identified your food safety plan from a hazard analysis point of view isn't where it needs to be. Now, they've indicated they will not be punitive at that stage. They'll give you more time, but you don't know when they're coming back. So having done the hazard analysis and presented it to them, they now want to know what you're doing about those foreseeable hazards. And they fall into 4 different categories. Not all of those categories apply to you. Most of the ones that are process preventive controls obviously apply to you because that's based on your process. Allergen preventive controls is based on how many allergens you have, and do all your products have the same allergen in them. And I, again, don't have time to go into great detail on that, but that's something we can work with you on. Sanitation is an issue if you're making ready to eat. It may be an issue for you when you're not making ready to eat, but the regulators are very concerned about it if you're making ready to eat. And so then they're going to be talking about what is your environmental swabbing program for Listeria, Salmonella, and potentially E. coli. And the last but not least was, do you have any hazards that you can't take care of and your supplier had to? So where's the evidence that you got that your supplier is taking care of them? And that supplier could be in Thailand, China, or anywhere else. But once you've identified there is a hazard that needs a preventive control, you have to have a recall plan. And now the FDA is going to look at that, which means looking at your recall team, looking at the fact that you've done a mock recall, looking at the ability you can do traceability, et cetera, et cetera. But the bottom line comes down to, have you implemented these programs? Are they being shown to be effective? And do you have records to show the FDA? So therefore, let's designate a person who will interact with the FDA during the whole inspection, your key person. Preferably your PCQI. Now remember, that's a Preventive Controls Qualified Individual. And the FDA expects that you had your food safety plan developed by a person who's a PCQI. Now that person can be a corporate person, they can be a consultant, but if they're not there on the day the FDA comes, then you're on your own explaining this plan. Therefore, it doesn't mean you have to develop it yourself, but you have to be able to answer the questions on it. So if you've got a PCQI in your facility, I would suggest you have 2, because if that person's not there and you never know when the FDA is coming in, you've trained a second person. And those are the people who are supposed to be the qualified individuals who know all the answers. Those are the ones you want to be reacting and interacting with the FDA. You want to be the ones that they are taking most of the questions. And you're the one who they're the one you hope will have all the right answers. That's why you need to practice. Practice as if the FDA is asking the questions. And if you're stumbling on coming up with the answers in a less stressful condition called a practice, then you're going to be stumbling over the answers when you're actually having when you're having the actual FDA audit. And the FDA may be willing to accept that some of the answers that don't make sense or lack of answers, then you better believe they're going to dig deeper. So what else do I need to have available? Because I'm not only going to have a food safety plan and have it in effect, I've got to be able to identify that when I have problems that I've done root cause analysis and I've done corrective actions. And I've got them documented because that is a requirement. Not that I'm going to discuss them and just say, hey, this is what we did and nothing's in writing. I got to show the FDA they are in writing. And that I found the problem, I corrected the problem, and the problem didn't come back. And if you've gone to that PCQI training, you know that the accuracy of the instrumentation that you're using, whether it be a water activity meter, a pH meter, a thermometer, they have to be calibrated. And you have to have calibration records, and you have to know what they were calibrated against. And you have to know the variability of those instruments even when they are calibrated, plus or minus what. You may not have to show your expertise as a PCQI, because obviously if you're coming across pretty credible to the FDA investigator, and you're answering all the questions, I'm not sure that I'm going to ask you, did you go to PCQI training, and ask you to prove a certificate. But if you're stumbling all over the answers, I'm going to be asking you questions about what is your background? What is your knowledge level? Did you go to PCQI training? Where did you work before? How much knowledge do you have about food safety? And you're bringing that on yourself because you're stumbling on the answers. That doesn't mean because you got a PCQI certificate that you maybe have all the answers, but you're going to be a little bit more prepared. When you talk about those third-party audit reports, have you got them? Are they in English? Is somebody reading them? Are you reacting to them? Are you making sure your audit, your supplier was done by a qualified auditor who therefore has had training in what to look for as well? This is just a warm body auditor, and I say that with respect. If you say I'm going to rely on ingredient lab analysis and we don't rely on third-party audit reports, that's acceptable. But which lab did it? Was it an accredited lab? Did they give you the full report? Did you get it from them versus it coming from the supplier who may have falsified it, like Peanut Corporation of America? Do you have a list of approved suppliers? Because one of the things, if the supplier's controlling the hazard, you can only buy from that approved supplier. You can only buy from that approved supplier's plant. And if you only approve one plant and only one supplier, you can't have that ingredient coming in from anybody else. That's what the FDA is going to be looking for, because you identified in your hazard analysis a hazard that's going to be controlled by the supplier, and you identified who the supplier was, and you identified how you were going to approve them, and that was based on a third-party audit or ingredient lab analysis. And now your hands are tied unless you're going to approve a second supplier or a third supplier or a second plant or a third plant. And now all of a sudden you've got an ingredient in that didn't come from an approved supplier. Don't expect the FDA to give you a break. But then when things go wrong and you have to do a recall, the FDA wants to make sure you have an up-to-date contact list for your customers. So who does that? When do you do that? Do you do that annually, that somebody calls each of your suppliers and makes sure you've got an up-to-date contact list, including daytime phone number, after-hours phone number, email, and a backup for every one of your suppliers' main contact in case their main contact is not available? Because the FDA realizes if you're having problems getting your product pulled out of the marketplace, more people's health and lives are at risk. And you can't be part of delaying getting your product out of the marketplace because you haven't kept your your customer list up to date. So let's talk about some more tips in handling your FDA inspection. Now, as we said, we're going rather fast. We'd like to get into more detail, but it's a little difficult and keep it within the time frame. But we will do some question and answers later. We will follow up with you and offer you the ability to get more information. So what are you going to do when you're handling an FDA inspection? Well, first of all, remember, you got to cooperate. It isn't something where you can be antagonistic, or you can just say you can't come in, or we wish you hadn't come today, can you come back? Those things don't apply. The FDA has a right to come and visit you at any time of the day that you're operating. So if you're operating 2 shifts, they can come in on second shift. If you're operating on weekends, they can come on weekends. And remember, their role is to be guardians of food safety and public health. And therefore, they're looking after you and me as a consumer. And if they do their job real well, we should have very little chance of when we buy a product that we're going to get sick and possibly die. And if they don't do a good job, then gosh knows what we're going to be buying in the marketplace. So recognize the fact that even though they're in your facility and they're questioning you, somebody's going to eat your products. So you hope that they're going to do a good job in your plant and in everybody else's. But it is stressful. And these are regulators. These are the government employees. They have the right to close you down. They have a right to seize your product. They have a right to do things. Now, a little bit more stressful than a GFSI audit, where the auditor can't close you down, can't seize your product, and can't make you do a recall. So remain calm, as hard as it may be. That's why you want to make sure the person who's talking to the FDA doesn't take questions personally, doesn't want to fight every question, or question why you're asking the question, or get uppy with the answer or something. Do not escalate the issue. If they say it's a problem, then you have to initially accept that. Maybe later your lawyers or somebody want to challenge the severity of what they found, but I don't think you want to do that while they're in your plant. Be prepared to discuss any deficiencies. Now, that doesn't mean challenge. That means discuss. Be sure you're clear on what they're saying. You've got a problem. Maybe even ask them to define why it's a problem nicely. This is, I don't believe it's a problem. You tell me why it's a problem. And now the FDA is a little defensive as well. If you can correct the issue right in front of them, that shows that you are prepared to react. If you don't correct it in front of them, you're leaving the door open for them to come back next week. Because if you didn't correct it, they maybe feel you're not going to correct it. They suspect you're not going to correct it. They have doubts that you are going to correct it. And then they say, well, I think we'll go back next week. If you correct it in front of them, chances are they're not going to come back next week. So what do I do before and after? Well, we talked before, you're going to practice. But what are you going to do during and after? Be prepared to discuss any corrective actions that you feel you want to do in response to them issuing you a 483, because that's what they'll do. They'll issue a 483, which is, well, they're going to record the deficiencies they found. You may say, I don't really want to discuss with them at this time, and you don't have to. And I want to think about what the problem is, because there may be many different ways to solve the problem, and I don't want to say one and then find out there's another one that's a better way to solve it. Just the same as if you say, well, I'll have it fixed by tomorrow. You may not want to say that if you don't think you can fix the problem by tomorrow. What you may want to do is say, we'll get it fixed as soon as possible, but meanwhile, we'll make sure that no product that's questionable with regard to food safety goes out the door. But we do need time to do root cause analysis, come up with the actual root cause, and actually come up with the corrective action that'll work. But remember, document every corrective action, whether you take it during the visit or after the visit. Because this is what you have to do by law now. And that means you have to document your root cause analysis and who was involved in it, and how you came up with what you thought was the root cause, and then what you did about it. And that all has to be in writing, and it has to be kept for several years. Communicate with the FDA transparently during and after inspections, including explaining if all of a sudden you gave them an acceptable time frame and you found you couldn't meet that time frame, then I think it's going to be better for you to go to them and say, hey, I said I'd have it done by Wednesday, but it turns out I find out we got to buy something and we got to do this, we got to do that, so it's actually going to be a week from Wednesday. I think it'd be better you went back to them versus they come back on Thursday and find out you didn't correct it on Wednesday. They will give you an opportunity to address the deficiencies before they take any further action. And they're generally not very aggressive with regard to seizing your product or closing you down. That happens when they feel you haven't addressed the problem and they've given you more time to address the problem and you still haven't addressed the problem. And they're now questioning whether you even know how to address the problem and whether you have competent people to address the problem. And they can't risk public health. So then in the end, they finish up giving you a warning letter, and then they finish up closing you down. And you can go to the FDA website and see who's had warning letters over the last year, 2 years, who's been closed down over the last 2 years. And you can see that they actually do issue warning letters and they do close people down. Conduct a debrief of your whole team. So what I would suggest is you have people following who are listening. and they're not doing anything else but listen and take notes. And they're watching body actions. And they're watching to see how they feel the FDA reacted to one of your answers. And that's not stuff you discuss with the FDA. That's stuff you discuss later when you all convene after the FDA leaves and you breathe a sigh of relief and you say they've gone and they gave us a couple of things in a 483, but it seemed like they were really happy or reasonably happy with us. So let's all sit down and discuss from all our perspective if everybody was involved in the plant to see if everybody feels the same way. Or did somebody pick up on something that the rest of you missed? That may be significant. And you look past it, but the FDA person didn't appear to look past it, didn't seem to like your answer from their body language, and seemed like that they were maybe preparing to come back. And if they're going to come back, they're coming back because they weren't quite happy with what they saw. And they're collecting and saving your corrective action responses. So it's not like you give them some stuff and they just basically say, okay, and then they don't file it away. They do. Remember, they're gathering information. The information they're gathering is available under the Public Disclosure Act, Freedom of Information. So therefore, some of your stuff can show up later being accessed by other people. So remember, you want to look like you're going to be reactive. You want to be reactive. You want to do the right things. You want to do root cause analysis, and you want to correct your problems, and you want to stop the FDA coming back again. So in order to do that, you got to practice, practice, practice. And I know you've heard this many times, and you've heard it in your GFSI audit. You got to do a mock recall. You got to do a traceability exercise. You got to do internal audits. You got to do all this stuff. And if you haven't been taking that serious, then I'll have to say to you, shame on you, because now the FDA is coming in to see how serious you were about doing these traceability exercises, the mock recalls, the crisis management scenarios, etc., etc. But now you're going to practice even having an FDA inspection, having an FDA visit. And therefore, you have to decide who's going to be on that team. Again, I don't have time to go through who I feel should be on the team. That's something we could do with you later. But you have to customize a team on who's going to be involved. And then you're going to have backups because the person you pick for the team may not be in that day. And you can't just wait for them to come. And the FDA is not going to sit in your meeting room waiting for you to get the key people in the room, because if you're operating, you have to have key people in the plant when you're operating, even if they're the backup key people. Make sure your receptionist knows how to handle the FDA and doesn't basically get them feeling upset at that time because she keeps them sitting in the lobby for half hour while she's trying to get hold of somebody and she hasn't offered them a chance for a glass of water or something, or a more comfortable seat, or check their IDs. And all of a sudden, there's out there going, come on, come on, come on. We're here. You got to let us in. We're not going to sit in the lobby forever. Designated team member who's going to be the main person to react to them. That most certainly won't be the most senior person in your facility who has many other things to do and who actually may not be in that day. Track the time by practicing. How long does it take you to go get those records that you said were readily available, and then all of a sudden, under pressure, you're finding out they're not as readily available, they're not filed properly, they're not immediately open, and therefore you're taking minutes, hours to find stuff. That's not going to look good. How serious were you when you did your food safety internal audits, which you said is part of what you do to find issues in your own plant and then do root cause analysis and have you practiced that with all your employees? Have you practiced interviewing your own employees, knowing that the FDA is going to come out and walk up to them and ask them a question? And now the FDA is going to find out the employee doesn't really know what they're doing. And you're going, I should have discovered that before the FDA did. Practice how you will escort the investigator. Remember to follow, not lead. Don't be taking the FDA over to something and say, I want to show you something. No, that's not how it works. Well, let me show you an improvement we made. No, they may not believe it's an improvement. So therefore, let them go, which they have a right, whatever they want, and you follow, and you observe, and you answer questions. But you have to practice how to listen and not talk. And therefore, you have to practice with their employees that they listen to the question, they answer the question, and don't keep talking. And the other people in the group who are going along, if you've got people who are available to go along, they can be observing, taking notes, and listening, and they don't have to do any talking. Make sure you're doing serious root cause analysis and not just going through an exercise to put something on paper to show the GFSI auditor. Because now you're going to put that in front of the FDA, who's going to be a little bit more questioning, a little bit more demanding, and maybe finish up making you recall a product if they feel there's any food safety issues with the problem with the product because your root cause analysis wasn't very good. And remember, after July of this year, if you're a large company, you have to have a food defense program in place with records and training, and we do all that. And we're willing to help you with that if you need us. So Holly, how about going through some of the opportunities that we got, and then we'll do questions and answers.
Yeah, that sounds great. We have lots of questions, Dr. Bob, so I'll drill through those in just a moment. But I just wanted to highlight, given that training is such a critical component to preparing for an FDA visit, we do offer a number of different public training courses, some of which are listed on your screen here. We can deliver all of these actually in on-site training as well, so at your facility. There's a link there to our website to look at the full calendar, but just thought I'd share this with the group. And on the next slide, we also have online learning, so a number of different, if you want to just click forward, that's great, thank you. Number of different topics that can be learned on as you go. So there are various durations between 1 and 3 hours are most of them, but lots of different topics to help train your team and keep that going. And we can even scale that with licensed packages as well. So with that, let's dive into the questions here.
Holly, let me add one extra thing to that. We did last year in 2018, we did actually some virtual training. And that meant you didn't have to travel anywhere, and me as an instructor didn't have to travel anywhere. And we did that for several major clients. Now, we can't do that with every topic because some topics the accreditation body for the actual subject matter doesn't allow that. But we can do some virtual training for you where you can actually involve more than one of your facilities. So if you're a multi-facility place, they don't have to travel, we don't have to travel. I'll just leave that there, and you can come back, and Holly and the rest of us will be willing to share how we can do that on certain topics.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, it's a public training course delivered virtually, and this just sort of helps you get different facilities in one place from a virtual environment. Yep, great point. Thanks, Dr. Bob. So if you want to click forward there, let's go through some of these questions. I guess the first and most obvious one, lots of folks ask this. Are folks obliged to have a person trained on the Preventive Controls qualified individual?
The actual definition by the FDA of a Preventive Controls qualified individual is a person who has either attended their class, which is the one that they put together, or has significant years of experience and qualifications that they can be considered a PCQI. So a short answer is no, it's not mandatory you go to the class. But the answer is you recommended that you go to the class if you're the one who's going to be putting together the food safety plan.
Yep. And another question, a lot of folks, they work for smaller organizations. Is a backup required in this regard? Because, one of our participants said, they're a small organization, they often travel. So if the FDA shows up and, they're the only person that's adequately trained in this regard, they're not there. What's your recommendation here?
I would think the answer is you have to have a trained person to back you up.
Sure.
Now, whether they're actually gone to the class, but they have to be versed enough to answer the questions. And that's why I said your PCQI could be a corporate person, but they generally don't reside in your plant. the person who's a consultant to put it together for you doesn't resolve in your plan. But it doesn't mean you can't have them do it, but then the person who's going to answer the questions better. I've learned a lot from that PCQI, because the other thing you got to remember, your PCQI may leave.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Okay. Is every company required to have an environmental monitoring program?
Environmental monitoring program, and first of all, it doesn't apply to those companies who are exempt. So that first list we had, and it only applies to those who are making a ready-to-eat product. So it doesn't apply to ingredient suppliers. It doesn't apply to anybody who isn't doing ready-to-eat. But remember, produce is ready-to-eat. So there's a big question going on now whether distribution centers who carry produce have to do environmental monitoring when they've got exposed produce in their own. But let's go back to manufacturing. The answer is you make ready-to-eat, yes, you have to do.
Okay. What about distributors? Are they still required to have environmental monitoring, food defense, and food fraud statements?
Well, again, it depends on what distributor you are. If you're doing a temperature ambient storage products that are fully packaged, you don't even have to do FSMA. If you're doing temperature sensitive products, then you have to do a reduced preventive controls. And if you've got produce, that's when the question comes whether you have to do environmental monitoring or not. And that's still somewhat of a vague issue.
Yeah, okay. Do you expect that there are a lot of going to be deviations sort of that are explained by basic issues? So companies not having a proper hazard analysis or written procedures. Do you foresee that the FDA inspections will be shorter if you're more prepared?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I think there's no doubt about it that the FDA gets the right answers, looks at a plan that's written in the format that they suggested, and you have lots of records and you can get in and out. They're going to get in and out. Not sure it's going to shorten up how many swabs they take, but they're only doing swabs, remember, in ready-to-eat facilities.
Yep. The FDA has a preventive controls matrix for hazards in product types. So Salmonella, Listeria, etc. It is not binding yet. Do you think it will be?
No, the FDA is trying to help you, so they've got a lot of educational information out on suggestions to you foreseeable hazards that you may not have thought of. They are saying that that is not set in concrete, meaning that there may be hazards come up in the future, but you're going to have an interesting conversation with them if they've identified a foreseeable hazard in a particular product and you don't consider it a foreseeable hazard. I would welcome to be in on that discussion you're going to have with the regulator.
Okay. On BRC conversion 7 to 8 training, it was stated that seafood companies need a food safety plan. Can you just comment on this? Are you
well, the seafood companies have to have Hasip, and that's been the regulation for many years that they have to have seafood Hasip. In fact, it goes back to 1998. So I don't think that BRC is saying anything that's different. And remember, no matter which GFSI standard you've gone with, you have to meet the regulations of the country in which you are selling your product. And therefore, if the FDA says that you've got to have a food safety plan, you do. And pretty well everybody requires a food safety plan, but they call it a Hasip plan in many other countries.
Okay. Can you just comment on what the expectations by the FDA are through FSMA with regards to intentional adulteration as it's required by July this year?
Well, what they require is, first of all, they require that you have trained your people. And they require that you put together a food defense plan where you have identified your vulnerabilities. And therefore, you have to do a vulnerability assessment, which is sometimes called VACCP, VACCP. And then you have to determine where there are the actionable process steps where you can do something to mitigate those potential threats. And therefore, you have to develop a mitigation strategies to be put in place at actionable process steps. Then you got to monitor the program. Then you got to have records of you monitoring the program. And remember, the FDA feels that your biggest threat is your own employees. So therefore, you're into who's watching who, how many of you got cameras, How do you make sure that the people in the building are the ones that work for you and you control them? And I can go on and on. There's a whole lot of stuff you gotta have it by July when the FDA walks in. If you're a large company, you've got about another year after that. If you're a smaller company, and 2 more years if you're a very small company.
Yeah, and noteworthy to put out to you, Dr. Bob, we're the driving force behind a course that satisfies these requirements and helps folks understand what are the requirements and how to build that food defense plan. So that's available to folks as well through public training as well as on-site. How far back down the supply chain do you think that the FDA will want to go for an FSVP supplier? So, for example, if finished, ready-to-eat good is coming from Canada to the U.S., would they want to know the PCs in place for the supplier's ingredients of the Canadian finished product?
Well, exactly right. They're going to be looking at them just the same as they're looking at domestic. The problem is they're a little short of personnel to do that, so they have already approved one third-party auditing company to do that, and they got several other third-party auditing companies who are going to help them do that. But they are going to be concerned about things like listeria, salmonella, and allergen labeling. And they've said those are the 3 biggest issues that they're worried about, whether a product's made domestically or made internationally. Now, if it's a ready-to-eat product, they're really concerned, obviously, about listeria, because the consumer is going to do nothing with the product except open it up. Therefore, again, I think they're going to concentrate more on the foreign suppliers making ready-to-eat products that are going directly into the marketplace.
Yep. And noteworthy to mention, there's some new law under the Safe Canada Food Act that's being put into place later this week that really sort of supports the FSMA regulations as well.
Yeah, let me talk about that a minute. Remember that goes into effect next week in Canada, and it requires Canadian companies to, first of all, be licensed. We call it registered. You call it licensed in Canada. And they have to be licensed with the CFIA if they're moving product across provinces or exporting product. You're increasing what is demanded of people sending product into Canada. And so therefore, I think you're going to get a more aggressive CFIA with product that moves around inside Canada and product that moves in and out of Canada. So I'm not sure it's going to be too much different in Canada than it's going through those steps in America right now.
Yep, sure. Can you just circle back, Dr. Bob, and highlight the timeline for requirements for food defense plan? It starts in July, but there's a scaling component to this. Can you just speak to that real briefly?
Yeah, and I off the top of my head, all I'll say to you is I need to get back. So whoever sent that, I'll send you the actual thing, because without pulling that up right now, but it is for large companies, it's July of this year, and then as you're smaller. But I want to be sure, because the government keeps varying what they mean by small and very small, and so I don't want to misquote something there. Yeah,
sure. So we'll share that separately to the one attendee there. That's great. Thank you. Prior to doing our food safety plan, we had a Hasip. So do we need to maintain the Hasip as well, or is having a food safety plan sufficient? So I guess there's just a bit of a...
Well, that's where it is. Yeah, that's where it becomes a little complicated, because when you've got the GFSI auditor coming in, they're looking for a Hasip plan. And when you're talking about FDA for seafood and juice and low acid canning, and the USDA looking for meat and poultry, they're using the word Hasip. You're going to keep your Hasip plan. The point is that if Hasip is sufficient, because your seafood, low acid, and juice, that's all you need. If you make it your preventive controls, remember the process preventive controls are really Hasip. So the first part would be your Hasip plan. What they want to do, though, they want to make sure you're putting more emphasis on allergens, environmental monitoring, and suppliers, which to the degree they should have been.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Going back to food defense again, lots of questions on food defense today. Is it required to have training for this food defense? And I think just to segue, I know speaking from the previous webinar, we can maybe just allude to whether training is required and then kind of why it's recommended.
They say training is required because you're going to make everybody aware that you're only going to be as good as the awareness of your employees. So therefore, for your hourly employees, it isn't anything more than just encouraging them to understand why they need to keep doors locked why they need to question people in the plants who they don't know and say, can I help you? That type of thing, versus they don't do, your employees don't know anything about food defense. You wouldn't share with your hourly employees where your vulnerabilities are, but you would with your supervisors. But the person who puts the plan together clearly needs to have some education, whether you want to call that formal training, whether you want to call that a certificate. Again, the FDA is going to say, if you can do all that without training, then okay, go for it. If the FDA comes in and you've gone for it and it isn't quite where it needs to be, you may be regretting that you didn't get some help in putting that together.
Yeah, okay. Is food fraud part of FSMA, and will the FDA be looking at it?
Say that question again?
Yep, sure. Is food fraud part of FSMA, and will the FDA be looking at it?
Yes.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, they're not going to be looking at it right now because they haven't come out with the food fraud regulations yet. But what they're saying to you is food fraud ties into several other things. It obviously ties into food defense because it's intentional adulteration. So therefore, food fraud and food defense, even though separate, do relate. It ties into food safety because in the end, you can finish up having something in the product that's going to cause people to have concerns. And they've identified it's $1 billion industry across the world. And so you have to do, at the minimum, is a food fraud analysis of the vulnerability of you to food fraud. If you feel that your product would be very, almost impossible to be fraudulent, meaning an ingredient, then obviously you're going to say, I don't need much, because if somebody was to substitute something for this, it would obviously be not something they could get away with. And he would talk about an egg is an egg, and an apple is an apple, and go on, and those are very simple analogies. But there are some places where it'd be very difficult to substitute something and not have it obvious. But in most cases, it's relatively easy to substitute stuff that looks like what you think you. The olive oil industry are two of the biggest industries, and honey are three of the biggest industries the food fraud is rampant in.
Yeah. Okay. Do the FDA recognize safe food for Canadian regulations?
Yes, they do, and that's why they give the Canadians a little easier way of getting product into the United States, along with New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah. Do Canadian facilities have exporting to the U.S.? Do they have to register with the FDA?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
And they have to register now with the CFIA.
Yeah. And FDA inspections are always going to be unannounced, really. Is that correct, Dr. Bob?
Correct. It'd be very rare that the FDA is going to tell you they're coming. Now, when it comes to some records for FSBP, the FDA has indicated that they may not come to see you for the records that go with the Foreign Supply Verification Program. They may just ask you to send them to a secure portal. And so in that case, you would get advance notice and you would not get a visit. But that's to do with records for the FSBP program.
Yeah, okay. Would you recommend that folks outside of the core group be trained in food fraud?
Say that again, because I got a little bit of an echo there.
Yeah, sorry, I think I got the question wrong here. Does there have to be a couple of people outside trained in food fraud? Oh, sent externally. I think that's what this participant meant.
Well, there's many places, and I think we've covered this in the past, that there are places like Michigan State University that conduct on a regular basis food fraud webinars. In fact, I'm going to be on one tomorrow. They run them almost every month. There are to use all the free available help, like these webinars that we give for you. And then after that, determine whether you need additional help.
Yeah, okay. How do you see the storage and distribution portion of this industry, specifically raw agricultural products, being implicated? Do you think they'll be subject to an FDA visit as well?
Well, raw agricultural products are all exempt except fruit and vegetables, so I would say that the FDA can come and see you if you're carrying produce, and may, but I would think they're going to concentrate more on the people making the ready-to-eat products other than produce.
Yeah.
I mean, other than produce and distribution, they're going to see produce in manufacturing for sure.
One participant said that she's seeing facilities that are not yet registered with the FDA, and they're worried that if they do register before they have a developed system in place, that the FDA will show up, prematurely before they're prepared. Do you have any comments in this space?
Well, one comment is you're illegal. So first of all, remember it's not an option not to be registered unless your sales are basically to yourself. And therefore, if you're selling to your own shops or your own ice cream shops, there is an exemption there. Otherwise, you have to be registered. But I do agree that once you register, you just went on the radar screen for the FDA. So if you're not registered now, then quickly get you where you need to be and then register, because I don't think you want to continue to be operating illegally.
Yep. Okay. So many questions, Dr. Bob. Okay. If the allergens are in a sealed package in corrugated boxes, does a risk analysis showing minimal issues due to the packaging allow them to be staged together or with other non-allergens?
Well, that's again a risk assessment you have to do, and I understand where you're coming from because I've gone into distribution centers myself, and I've seen some really thick plastic bags with nuts in them, and the questions being, what would it take for the nut to get out of that bag? It would take almost a forklift going through the box, through the bag. In that case, you would determine that the risk is minimal, and therefore you wouldn't have to worry about it. But again, you have to understand that you want to take any question away from a regulator, any possible question away from a GFSI auditor. So unless you really don't have space to store all the allergens separately, I wouldn't default to the packaging protect them if I've got space. Now, if I don't have space, then I would get into the risk assessment. But remember, the risk is to be determined by individual facilities, by the most senior person in your facility. And if they do that risk assessment right and they're willing to accept the risk, then hopefully that the FDA will agree with the fact that they don't have a risk.
Okay. I'm new to the quality assurance world. I have done a lot of webinars such as this one and self-study on the subject. I've completed our food safety plan. What exactly would you suggest formal training be? So if I were to attend formal training externally, what would be the recommendation to prepare for a FSMA audit?
Well, the PCQI training is very good. It is a good 2.5 days of your time, and it does have examples, and you do finish up getting templates, and you do get to visit with other people and hear some of their challenges. And I'll tell you, I'm not saying that because I teach that class. I'm not saying that because we teach that class. I'm saying it because I think it's a very good class. It was well thought through, and the book you get it with it is 580 pages long, just crammed full of information to help you. If you feel I got all the answers, then I wouldn't spend your money or your time going to that class. But be sure that you are as good as you think your hazard analysis was.
Yeah, indeed. I've not heard anything negative about that course. It's really well-rounded. Are flexible packaging manufacturers exempt from FDA FSMA inspection?
They're exempt if they're domestic. They're not exempt if they're foreign.
What about a canned product?
Canned product comes under low acid canning, and the answer is they're exempt. They have to meet the low acid canning regulations, but they do, like everybody, have to meet the new GMPs.
Okay. Just a few more questions here. I know that we're over, but we have most folks staying on with us, so thanks everyone. We had an inspection from the Californian Health Department. The auditor said it was contracted FDA inspection. Do you know if this will affect whether or not the FDA themselves would come to visit? It was a pretty basic audit. So any comment or knowledge of that, Dr. Bob?
Yeah, California is a more aggressive state when it comes to the state being willing to do FDA inspections. And I've had a lot of those people in my class. So when you talk about the PCQI training and you say who's been coming to that class, the regulators been coming to that class. I've had FDA people in my classes in St. Louis, out of Kansas City, and out of St. Louis. I've had FDA people from California, from LA come to my classes. And I've had state people. And in California, I had lots of state people come, particularly for the dairy industry. Those dairy inspectors are more likely to be the ones coming in and doing FDA inspections. And yes, they are approved, and they have to tell you they were doing an FDA inspection when they came in, so you knew they weren't doing a state inspection.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
And the point is that once they've come in, the FDA is not coming in, because they actually came in as if they were the FDA.
Yep. Okay. Will the FDA be looking at label compliance during an audit?
Oh, yeah, particularly with regard to allergens. And again, if you're making any claims that you're not legally allowed to make, like saying this will make you healthy or make you live till you're 90 or whatever other claims that are medical claims that you can't make, you better believe they'll review your labels.
Okay. Earlier you mentioned that once you have approved suppliers, you cannot obtain from other suppliers. Would it be sufficient to obtain a Hasip certificate from that supplier indicating that there's compliance to the CFR document? Would you suggest that companies have backup approved suppliers? That's the end question.
Well, yeah, the point is that you want to have more than one supplier, simply because if that supplier has a problem, a fire, or has gets closed down by the FDA, or any other reason that they can't make a product for you, meaning an ingredient, and if that's an ingredient and you don't have another approved supplier, you're basically out of business on the product or products that that ingredient goes into. Now, the FDA says on an emergency basis, you can approve other suppliers, provided you get the third-party audit reports, or you get the product analyzed, or you do some other determination of that supplier and have proof on that before you bring in the ingredient from that new supplier, and not after you bring in the ingredient. But then they're expecting you then to approve that temporary supplier as an approved supplier.
Okay. If you attended the PCQI training in 2016, would you recommend repeating the course since food fraud has been added?
No, because they don't get into food fraud in it, so the answer would be no. Now, I would imagine that once they get food fraud where they need it to be, the FDA is most likely going to come up with some type of food fraud training. But I don't see that on the horizon right now.
Yeah, okay. What's a good example? Oh, sorry, let me go back here. As a ready-to-eat candy repacker, do you need to have COAs on all items getting repackaged in order to address biological hazards?
Well, it depends if your candy is exposed. If it's not exposed, then it's not going to get contaminated. So if all you're doing is breaking units into smaller units, taking wrapped candy and putting it into bags, then you're not going to fall into the environment of having an exposed product. So the answer would be, I'd need to know more about exactly what you're doing.
Okay. Do closed package distribution companies need a GMP plan?
Do closed packaging companies?
Sorry, do closed package distribution companies, beg your pardon, need a GMP plan?
No.
No. Okay.
Well, they have to meet the GMPs, yeah, because the GMPs cover pest control and cover having your building not have leaking roofs, etc. So the answer is everybody's covered by the GMPs.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. I think we'll cap it off there. We're 10 minutes past the hour. If there's anyone that we've not answered your question to, Dr. Bob will reach out to you on a one-to-one basis. A reminder that we'll share a link to the recording as well as a slide deck within 2 business days. With that, Dr. Bob, a big thank you for your presentation. Lots of positive feedback received on this end. And with that, I wish everyone a wonderful day.
Thank you.